Okay, let's get started, everybody. Welcome to the November 8th, 2024 meeting of the Baltimore Regional Transit Commission. I'm John Laria, the Commission Chair. Thank you, commissioners, for being here, as well as people, interested parties, both in the audience and online. We have a substantial number of people online. I want to acknowledge Assistant Secretary Jacqueline Hartman, who many of you know is online. She is sitting in for Tony Bridges because Tony is out of town. I forget exactly. So thank you very much, Assistant Secretary. I hope you'll be able to participate, even though it's virtual. I see also Commissioner Cardona is online, and many other interested parties. We certainly have a quorum in the room, and that just adds to it. So we are fine to proceed. I just wanted to make two sort of general comments before we move on to the printed agenda. One is about the CTP. Everybody has now seen the comments letter on the CTP that the Commission sent out. I thank many of you provided feedback, which we did our best to incorporate. Drafting by committee is not the easiest thing to do, but we tried to incorporate comments that we had, all constructive comments about the letter. I'm very happy with the letter, proud of the letter. I think it takes the right approach, it identifies the right issues, it has the right tone, and describes both the seriousness with which we take this, as well as our interest in working cooperatively with all parties to try and work on the CTP issues. We did actually I've gotten good feedback from a number of people only in the last day, including County Executive Pittman, who was nice enough to send a note saying that he read it and thought it was a good letter. Those of you whose county executive have not sent nice notes back, I encourage you to. It's only, I'm gonna get a note today from Baltimore County. It's only been out for a day. I will encourage you also to circulate that letter to whoever you wish. It's certainly a public letter, to the extent that it reflects the work that we've been doing here, and that you all think, priorities and is a concise way of summarizing issues. Please feel free to send it to whomever you like. We've sent it to sort of the obvious list of folks you would expect, obviously in the administration and legislature, business and advocacy groups, and I think it'll continue to get circulated as part of the process. But regarding the bigger process, we do have to figure out, all of us who are stakeholders, and what the next steps are in that. If we don't just launch the letter and hope for a good outcome. People have asked what role the Commission can play in that. And not only is it sort of, I guess I would say it's not really optional. People have said to me, well, you're there in part to help bring the region together. Not that there aren't ways to do that, BMC itself and others. So we are looking for ways to convene that kind of discussion among the relevant stakeholders to see if we can come up with a common agenda. I think the CTP process itself and what the jurisdictions did began to reflect for the first time in a long time some common themes and a common agenda and common views on the CTP, which I think was noticeable to people who've been watching this process for a while. And it's going to continue to be important to do that. There's a sort of subtle aspect of that, which is the question of, can we prioritize? And I think if you watch the CTP conversations, there was at least some, I'll call it a soft prioritization of two things. One is the light rail infrastructure, so that to preserve or protect the federal grant for light rail cars. Meaning, let's not give money back. I frankly think that is almost impossible to imagine that this administration would let that happen. But we want to be sure, and it's a natural priority. Also, there was discussion about meeting the TSIA levels of state of good repair. Again, sort of not a made up benchmark, not a subjective benchmark, but a number that's out there by the in law. And that also is a pretty good marker. So those two things were discussed. They don't reflect, obviously, an investment that would do what the system needs, but at least they're two things that you can draw a fairly bright line about. I'm not suggesting those are the priorities that we have necessarily or you have, but it wouldn't surprise me if there's going to be some, at some point there's going to be a what's the most important stuff and how do we decide that? So I imagine that there'll be some discussion about that. Those two things that I just mentioned, as well as others, are of course in the letter. So there's a foundation for that, but we'll just have to sort of see what the opportunities are to try and restore funding from the draft to the final CTP and how everybody wants to come at that. So more to come, and we're going to be working hard in the run up to the legislature to figure out what can be done, and we want to participate in that conversation. The second thing is there was an election this week. I'm sure people have strong views about the outcome of that election. For our perspective, from those of us sitting in this room with this agenda, there were questions about what does it mean for transit. There was a piece in the banner. I see Danny Sawadney from the banner, I think, is online. I encourage you to read it. It's just it's kind of a first pass at what do people think is going to happen specifically about the red line, which obviously needs federal funding to proceed. Danny interviewed me and I said, the state can't do it alone. We're going to need federal assistance, but obviously no one knows what that's going to look like. I'm not prepared to be sort of fatally pessimistic about the possibility of federal funding for the red line, because I frankly have no idea what the real priorities are going to be for this incoming administration. I mean, everybody is scrambling to figure this out across hundreds, if not thousands, of priority and funding areas. But we should not be assuming that we're not going to be able to find some sort of federal partnership. And I think we're going to work as hard as possible to make sure that happens. I think the governor is, I think that reflects the governor's view. I'm not speaking for the governor, of course, but it's a priority. We're going to do everything we can do to make that happen. To some extent, it may be beyond our control, but I am not writing off the prospect of federal investment in transit, or specifically federal investment in the red line. And I don't think any of us should. It doesn't mean we can't be nervous and anxious about it. In fact, you'd be a little crazy not to be nervous and anxious about it. But we've got to sort of stick to our mission, and hopefully, there's some room there. So we'll just have to see. I just wanted to say those two things at the outset on two kind of important topics that are not otherwise directly on the agenda. So Don, I'll turn it. Anything administrative for you before we turn it over to Holly?
Two things. One, to follow up on your point about the CTP tour, I'll forward to the commission the links to the videos that are available online if you care to watch them. And two, we have some dates that were proposed at the bottom of today's agenda. Some likely will be problematic, but we're looking at least 6 meetings of the commission in next year that allow us some time in between to work with the working groups.
Yeah, right. We're discussing, we talked early in this commission about, and I've said since, that I think meeting monthly was absolutely necessary in this first year. It may not be necessary in the second and subsequent years, particularly if you want the work groups to ramp up their work to sort of balance demands on your time. So we don't, these are proposed dates, don't calendar them yet, but I think Don or the staff will be asking you at least to give feedback. I've already said I think January 3rd might be too close to the new year, but we'll figure out the dates. I think what we're likely to do is to put 6 dates on the calendar, hard dates, and then fill in as necessary. It's not beyond possibility that we might need to have an off-cycle meeting of the commission if we decide to go on a 2-month basis. And it's not going to excuse folks from working in work groups and smaller groups if we have to do that. I wanted to say one other thing. Don reminded me when he said tour, not really good. There's a footnote of all things in the CTP letter that references the tour that we took of light rail. I hope that everybody, I wasn't keeping track of who went in which group. I hope everybody had a chance to do that. First of all, we had a tour originally, and we saw some great stuff and some great people working hard back in several months ago. And I think we said, well, that's great, but we'd also like to see some more trouble stuff. And the light rail is a good example of a system that has challenges some of which have been reported. very publicly, in terms of, car availability and outages and so on that are affecting people. And those are significant issues that relate to the resources available to light rail. A little bit of an under the hood look was on that tour for those of us who went to look at things that public doesn't see, like the traction power substations, which are in tenuous shape, some of them, like seriously. And I think we were surprised, speaking for myself, I was very surprised to hear about the precariousness of those stations and the impact that an outage in one of them could have, including not, I wouldn't say especially, but the one in the North Yard station, which is the one that we visited, that powers getting the trains in and out, getting the cars in and out of the yard to the main line to provide service. It's working, but the engineers will tell you, and Holly and Ken and others can correct me if I'm wrong, that there's real concern and that they're sort of nursing it along, because again, they're incredibly talented, devoted people. We met some folks who were clearly passionate about trying to keep this system running, and thank God we have them. But those are underfunded, and the idea of losing one of those traction power substations in a way that could in the worst example, shut down the light rail service is unacceptable. And talk about priorities, we have to find a way to do everything possible to make sure that doesn't happen. I've asked MTA for some more detail to sort of flesh out that sort of anecdotal, kind of what we heard at the tour, and they're working on that. I will share it with you when we get it finalized so that you can appreciate how serious an issue it is, and how much of a gap there really is between the risk of these stations going offline and what's budgeted for them. It's hard because they're not. It's not like the date that station is gonna shut down. So you have the added anxiety and uncertainty of when's it, what could happen, when might it happen, and are we prepared? And it is also, I would say, a good example of something a number of you have pointed out before, I think Mike in particular, of sort of, the inefficiency of spending money to keep things kind of going, to patch things up, when the real solution is to find the money to replace them and to improve them. And so it was a very useful, Holly, thank you, and Ken and others, very, very useful insight into that, that situation. And these things make the difference between, whatever you may think about the light rail system, the difference between having it and not having it is pretty obvious, right? So I just wanted to mention that, and we'll be following up on that and giving you some more information. So sorry, enough of that. Okay, Holly, MTA administrators update, please.
Okay, great. And yes, acknowledging we do have a tenuous situation on light rail. We are preparing, right? So just to be really clear, MTA does prepare every single day for the worst potential outcomes, and we do everything we can to stave those off. So just want to make sure that everyone is aware that we are, as an agency, continuing to work, continuing to make improvements, continuing to make sure that we're preparing for when things happen and how we're going to respond to them. So that is something we are constantly working on.
I want to characterize that in this way. This is not about the agency. This is about the agency's budget. Okay, it's not about the agency. People
so
are.
I'm not just.
No, I know.
I
just want to emphasize. I just want to emphasize that I was really struck, and other people said the same thing, by how well you are managing, considering the resources you have been given.
No, and I appreciate that. Yeah, again, budget wise, but I do want to just make clear to riders that the system's not going to go down tomorrow. If it does, then we are prepared for those situations. We are able to react. We do have, contingency plans for all sorts of different things, and we are working as best we possibly can to ensure that that won't happen. So just want to reassure folks, the light rail is safe, continues to be safe. If that ever changes, we will not operate. I also want to highlight, I always like to use this as an opportunity to think about positive. You know, I think sometimes there's a lot of negative in the world and there's still a lot of positive things that MTA is doing. So wanted to share that. So I'm going to start with the red line. We did hold open houses in October. We had 5 public open houses, over 400 attendees, over 250 comments were received. And the comment period is still open through November 25th. There's a survey. If you go to the redlinemaryland.com, you can fill it out there, and I encourage folks to take a look and do so. We are still looking for feedback on the alignment. That's where we haven't really kind of nailed that down in a couple of places, but in particular on the east side. So we're definitely open to suggestions and ideas that people might have regarding red line alignment over there. The project is continuing to move forward. Again, we will need federal funds, but you know, we have gone through this before and we know how to handle it, and we're familiar. So we're preparing for all kinds of different situations, and it's still a very important project that needs to move forward, and so we're committed to making that happen. We now have integration in between 2 of the apps that MTA uses the most or promotes the most. So CharmPass is MTA's ticketing app. Transit app is the kind of real-time information app that we encourage folks to use. And so now when you open Transit app, you will actually see at the bottom a little thing that says get tickets. And so you can click on that and it will take you directly to the CharmPass so that you can have your tickets there. So we're trying to make it a little bit easier for new people, for people who aren't familiar with the CharmPass, as that is the best option to purchase tickets. And so we're really proud that that has now come out there. When you go to a lot of different cities and use their transit agencies, you see it within the app. And so now MTA is joining those. We did provide free transit on our core service modes and mobility on election day. It's the first time that we've done this, but we joined transit agencies around the country in making sure that transportation is not a barrier for folks who want to go vote and get to the polls. Got a lot of really positive feedback. I think people appreciated that as an option for being able to go vote. We also, it's part of a state law, but we do, whenever folks go to certify at mobility, we have a voter registration check and reminder. So if they aren't registered to vote, they have the opportunity to register at the same time that they're doing the mobility. So we are doing everything we can to make sure that folks can access that right. Veterans Day. So Veterans Day is coming up on Monday. We have a lot of veterans at MTA, and so we do want to celebrate and thank them for their service. So we have our employee resource group is going to be participating in the mayor's Veterans Day parade on Saturday, so tomorrow. So you will see an MTA bus. We have a new wrap that we'll be unveiling with a number of our employees walking with that. And we're going to be offering for the 6th year in a row free rides for U.S. military veterans, active duty, National Guard on November 11th. So they just need to show their ID and they'll get a ride for free on Veterans Day. We've been committed to professional development inside the agency. It's really important that we have good succession plans, that we're building up our internal leaders. We have a lot of fantastic folks who have started as operators, have started mechanics, moving up through the ranks, and we want to help them to grow in their careers. It's hard when you go from being like a mechanic and then all of a sudden you're a supervisor and you haven't been trained on how to be a supervisor. And so we now have this emerging leaders program where we identify employees. They're able to kind of self-select and apply, but they do have to get a recommendation from their manager. It's a 9-month curriculum, so it starts in January every year. And they go through 1 day a month with workshops. They have mentors, internal mentors that are leaders within the agency. All of the agency's leadership engages with them. We have different opportunities for them to ask questions. And then they do a research project. So we assign them different topics to take a look at. So this year, for example, they looked at, what are other agencies doing in terms of bus to rail or rail to bus transfers, especially like late at night. Like that's one area that is a little bit of a struggle. If you get to the metro station, get off, and your bus has just left and the next bus isn't coming for another half hour, like what do you do? And so what are other agencies doing? So we got some good ideas on that one. Looking at a few other different things. And so we're gonna, I think, implement a lot of the ideas that are coming out of these groups.
How long has that been going on?
This is our 2nd year, so our 2nd class. This is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, so I'm very proud of this program that we were able to get up and running. So our 2nd class did graduate in October. We're recruiting now for our 3rd class, and so that'll be coming out, I guess, in January. Next week is the Making Connections Conference. So this is a conference that is sponsored by the Transit Workforce Center in coordination with USDOT FTA. It's being held here in Baltimore, so we're really proud to be the host. It's going to be at the Hilton downtown. So it starts on Monday, goes through Wednesday. I'm gonna be participating with Mike. He and I get to welcome everyone in the opening session. There's a couple other sessions that we're doing, talking about some of the really great work that we've done in workforce development in partnership with the unions. We've got the apprenticeship program, which just kicked off, and we'll be talking about, we're one of the kind of leading agencies there. Our work on the Joint Safety Council that we do, I would venture to say we're probably one of the best in the nation on that. I think we've got a really great partnership and working really well there. So we'll be talking about some of those things, sharing information with kind of fellow transit agencies from around the country. So yeah, really excited about that. If you're interested, you can check out the website, register and go. I think it's a great opportunity to learn about workforce and transit workforce in particular. I wanted to highlight, again, we're making some good progress on the Metro railcar testing. I think last time we met was the day before a weekend shutdown to do the first set of testing. We are now also the day before a weekend shutdown to do the second round of testing. So starting at 8 p.m. tonight through Monday morning, we'll open up for first service Monday morning. Metro will be shut down. We will be offering shuttle buses. We are testing the rail cars with the signal system. And so I'm gonna go along this weekend. I'm really excited. We're gonna be testing end to end on the line in full automatic train operation, ATO. So, you know, you get to the station, the train stops itself, the doors open. We're really excited to see how that goes. The last round of testing went incredibly well. They accomplished more than what they had hoped. And so I'm hopeful that this one does as well. We're still gearing up for summer of 2025 to bring new rail cars in service. And I just want to thank you all for coming on the facility tours. We got the opportunity to go see light rail, as you mentioned, and also go over to our Eastern bus facility and the opportunity to ride Metro again. So just, you know, happy to continue to host and show the hard work and the folks at MTA. Like I'm up here speaking, but the folks who are actually doing it, it's like a good opportunity for them to get to talk about the work that they're doing. So that's all I've got for you today. Happy to take any questions.
Questions for the administrator? Yeah, please.
So I appreciate the opening slide, Holly, about redlining the fact that we've been here before, but the reality is that before was often an 11-year pause to this. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like for me, it's fire on fire, right? Like this is not, and so I get we still believe in it, administration still believes in it, et cetera, but without the federal funding, the project can't move forward. And that's a big question mark. And so that feels very like hair on fire to me, and I don't know how the administration is thinking about this or you guys, but it seems more than just a gloss over it. So I wanted to call that out and just see how are you guys thinking about that? What's been the early conversations? I mean, it seems like a pretty big.
I mean, we're committed to the project. We're committed to moving it forward. You know, we've been planning on federal funds. I will note that in the last Trump presidency, the capital investment grant program continued to move forward. There were less grant awards, but it did still exist. I know that there's been some discussion about that not happening, but we've got to react to things when they happen. You know, we're planning for all sorts of different possibilities, but until, you know, that happens, there's not a lot we can do, right? Like we do know that transit funding in general, especially formula funding, does receive kind of broad bipartisan support. And so we anticipate that that's going to continue, but you know, we're planning for different scenarios and we'll react when it happens.
Any other questions for Holly? Okay, thanks very much. Who's handling the capital enhancement prioritization program?
Jeff Anderson is online.
Was online. Before we do that, I'm sorry, just one thing. I said I would do this at the beginning, totally forgot, Lakey. We introduced ourselves to each other at the beginning of this commission. I don't know if anybody else's job has changed. If it has, please let me know. But Lakey's has recently, and I just wanted her to just give you 30 seconds of what her new role is, so you can appreciate what she's up to.
Okay, hello everyone. So I am not quite a month into my tenure. I'm now at Greater Baltimore Committee. I'm the new Chief Economic Officer. And I think that, well, the quick version is that I'm over the business investment economic development portfolios. That's business retention, expansion, business attraction, capital investment attraction, as well as startups entrepreneur. That includes the federal tech hub designation for people that are aware that we are in the Baltimore region tech hub. I think what's most important about the role is that we're thinking about economic development at a regional level, 7-county regional level. And certainly with the leadership of Mark Anthony Thomas over the past 2 years, where GBC is from, perhaps its, multi-decade legacy is very different. So my charge is regional. I think that has a lot of relatability to my role on the commission. I am a Howard County resident. That is how and why I was appointed here. I did live and work in Howard County, but I think this opportunity to function from a work perspective on a regional scale will really just help better inform my role on the commission.
Thanks. Great. We're excited for you, for the GBC and for the regions. That's great. Okay, sorry, Don, back to you. And Jeff is, you said, there he is. We.
Ready?
Jeff, over to you. Can we see?
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. I see there's a limited time for this, so it's definitely going to be the highlights of the highlights. MDOT is working to update its capital expansion prioritization program, and I think I'm going to need someone to advance the slides. So if we can.
Just because we can't hear you very well. Just give us 1 second. Is there any volume enhancement that we can achieve here?
Can you hear me? Is that?
Well, we can hear you. It's not like you're on mute. It's just a volume issue.
Okay. I don't know that there's anything I can do on my end.
Got the speaker all the way up here.
Huh. Should we just let him continue and we'll
I can try to speak loudly. I don't know if that makes a difference.
when's that? What?
You all are muted for me now.
We are muted.
Unmute. There we go.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, technology. Thank you.
Is this any better?
Much better.
Okay, terrific. Well, my name is Jeff Anderson. I'm Chief of Planning, Programming, and Project Delivery in the Secretary's Office. I'm really pleased to be able to be here today to talk with you all about our efforts to update our capital expansion priority process. I think someone can someone advance the slides as I indicate?
I'll do that.
Okay, appreciate it. So this is definitely going to be the highlights of the highlights, just given the time we have on the agenda. Go ahead and advance. This is really responsive to the direction from the governor, from our secretary. The governor's talked a lot about being data-driven and heart-led. When I think about prioritization, that's exactly what it is. It is where do you want to go? What are you trying to accomplish? And then how do you use data and analysis to figure out which projects are in fact going to get you to those goals best. Next slide. The reason we're updating the Chapter 30 process, we've received some feedback that the current process isn't really seen as particularly transparent or necessarily fair. It's not clear how it's related to the projects that end up in the CTP. And frankly, the process for creating the CTP and bringing projects in hasn't changed a lot in the last several years. We're also looking at kind of other adjacent areas where we might reform a little bit the process to try to make it more transparent and to get better outcomes. Next slide. The new process is really just about making sure we get the most bang for the buck. How are we spending our state dollars, our federal dollars in the way that really gets the maximum benefits? We want to evaluate potential capacity projects using data analysis to create a ranking. And we want that to be, as I said, transparent, accountable. People understand how we're getting to the decisions we're getting to. And we're hoping that some of the process changes we're talking about can also provide improved certainty in terms of on time, on budget delivery. Next slide. So what are we trying to accomplish when we make investments in transportation, surface transportation? It is really about the following outcomes: safety, accessibility, mobility, and so forth. These are kind of our guiding goals and principles and values that we are trying to accomplish when we are investing in new capacity projects. Next slide. We are this is kind of an aside, but we have applied for a $2 million federal grant. Our intention, if we get that grant, is to use it in a way to really improve the user interface of this process, to make it really easy to access and easy to pull up projects, to look at what people have submitted, to look at how they've scored, where they are on maps, be able to put public input and feedback on those things. But we will proceed with this process of an updated prioritization schedule, regardless of whether we get this federal grant. Next slide. So the prioritization parameters, next slide. We're really talking about surface transportation. We're talking about highways, roads, public transportation, walking, biking. This is consistent with the current Chapter 30 parameters, and so it excludes the airports and ports. Next slide. We're looking at capacity enhancing projects. So if you are adding to the system, bringing on more service or adding more lane miles, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about projects or investments that are about maintaining the current system or state of good repair. We're looking at capacity enhancing projects over $5 million. There are numerous projects in our portfolio, and we don't want to sort of capture them all in this, because we want to, well, in part just because of the logistics of trying to score that many projects, and in part just to stay nimble with our smaller projects. It does mean, of course, that if you are going to score projects, you need a minimum amount of information to do that: where the project is, what the mode is, some amount of level of design happening, so that you have some ideas about how much the project is going to cost, what kinds of interventions it will entail in terms of safety, other things. So we think about it as sort of a 10 to 15% design having happened in order to be able to submit it for scoring. This is consistent with the current Chapter 30 process as well. Next slide. We're talking also about adding some potential applicants. So MPOs and transit agencies would be able to also submit projects in addition to the currently eligible applicants, and MDOT itself would be putting all of its capacity expansion projects into the same process. We don't feel we have a monopoly on great projects, so we're going to see how ours score and how others score, and try to pick the best ones. Next slide. We are looking at, given the number of potential applicants, we're looking at basically having a scale for the number of applications that can be submitted, depending on the number of people served or the size of the entity submitting, and as well as having two levels of funding to apply for. One in that $5 to $20 million range for smaller projects, and the second in the $20 to $400 million range. Projects that are above $400 million would be considered outside of this process. They tend to, in many ways, tend to have their own funding arrangements that need to be made, and other factors that we thought just made it appropriate to just move it into its own bucket. So really, this is the $5 to $400 million. That could be adjusted as the process gets implemented and we see how it's working and get feedback from stakeholders, but that's the kind of initial thinking. Next slide. In terms of the project evaluation, we definitely want it to be analytical and not subjective. So we want it to be quantitative. We want it to be linked as close as possible to the outcomes that we're seeking, to the goals that we have, the values that we're pursuing. We are looking, as I mentioned, a couple of adjacent process changes. So, for instance, prioritization letters, trying to put some better guidance around prioritization letters, perhaps creating an online portal for their submission, getting public feedback on the rankings during the CTP tour, other things that just try to make the whole process more transparent. Next slide. One of the other changes that we're considering for this process is not for the CTP overall, but for the portion that is about capacity enhancing or capacity expansion projects, doing those on an every other year basis. So the CTP would continue to come out annually, but instead of having project expansion projects every year, every other year, we would be considering project expansions. And that goes hand in hand with another piece of kind of reform that we would be looking at, which is to try to identify at the beginning of a round of funding how much funding is available for capacity expansion. So we might say there is $450 million available in this round of capacity expansion. Then people would know the level of resources that were available and could apply with projects that sort of kept that in mind. Doing it every other year would allow us to combine funding from 2 years to create a larger pot. And I think that would both create the opportunity for larger projects to come in and give a wider range of projects to consider as we are trying to find the best projects that deliver the greatest benefits. It also provides us with time in between the rounds to basically review the prioritization process and improve the selection, work with our partners and stakeholders to see how it's working and make any changes that might be appropriate from that perspective. Next slide. So as I said, our intention would be to identify the amount of funding available, and then to the degree possible, if a project is selected for funding, fully fund that project through construction. And all of you, I'm sure, are aware that many projects exist right now within the CTP that have design funding only, or design and engineering, or partial other phases. This creates both uncertainty on our stakeholders' part, our partners' part, in terms of when and if projects will ultimately get full funding through construction. It also creates significant uncertainty internal to MDOT in terms of trying to hold ourselves accountable for delivering projects on time and on budget. Delays obviously affect the cost. Those have to get rerun. New money has to get found. So to the degree that we can, we would be reflecting full funding in the CTP. There are currently funding streams that have their own processes for allocation: highway user revenue, lots funding, the TAP program, CMAQ, etc. Those would continue to have their own funding allocation processes. They would not be subject to this prioritization process. But any sources of funds, state or federal, that do not have those kinds of processes already spelled out would basically go through this process if they're funding capacity enhancements. Next slide. So selection of projects ultimately in the CTP would be a three-step process. The first step would be to have projects submitted to a project portal. They would be ranked based on the scoring system, which would be basically data and analysis driven. You would get a basically 1 through 40 ranking if there were 40 projects submitted, for instance. Those would be published in the draft CTP, and then we would get feedback through the CTP tour on that ranking. After that, the secretary could review the project rankings, consider stakeholder feedback, consider other factors, whether there's a particular emphasis on safety, or whether there are issues with geographic equity, other factors, and essentially bring that, make any changes to the list, and then bring that list to some sort of public forum where those changes would be explained. And then the final step would just be submitting that final CTP to the legislature. Next slide. So in terms of the scoring measures and criteria, the following are basically what we're using. Go ahead. They align and basically sort of reflect our particular values. Next slide. So for instance, in safety, we're looking at what does a project do in terms of reducing fatalities and serious injuries, and what does it do relative to the amount of use the facility gets. So if a road gets a lot of traffic and has the same number of fatalities and serious injuries as a very little used roadway, relatively speaking, that little used roadway is in fact more dangerous. So it's trying to sort of normalize for the amount of use that the facility gets. Next slide. Accessibility and mobility, we have an increase in what does the project do in terms of increasing access to jobs, and what does it do in terms of increasing non-single occupant vehicle trips. Those are the two measures for accessibility and mobility. Next slide. Climate change in the environment looks obviously at the impact of the project on greenhouse gas emissions, and then on the impact on criteria pollutants. Credit or scoring would really only apply on measure 6 on the criteria pollutants in areas where the area is in non-attainment currently. If it's in attainment, that measure would not apply. Next slide. Social equity, this is basically taking earlier measures on access to jobs and safety and narrowing the view in to look at what it does, what the project does just in terms of increasing access to jobs for those living in disadvantaged communities, what it does in terms of reducing fatalities and serious injuries in those communities. Next slide. Economic competitiveness, reduction in person hours of delay would be a measure under this area, and then an increase in productivity of land supported by the project. MDOT does some projects with the intention of increasing accessibility to sites to enable economic development, and the sort of generic way to reflect that in this criteria is basically saying, what does the increase in access to the affected areas do in terms of land value? The increase in land value essentially reflects its increased potential to support economic development. Next slide. Then our final measures are sustainable land use and demand management, and that's reflected in basically an increase in non-work accessibility, which is a little bit awkwardly phrased, but essentially this is recognizing the fact that development patterns do a lot to drive transportation outcomes, and projects that are supporting developments that actually put less stress on the transportation infrastructure, that provide more multimodal opportunities, that provide relatively convenient access to a lot of destinations, whether by foot, by transit, by car, by bike. Those projects that are supporting those development patterns are basically given credit for doing that because they put less stress in turn on the transportation system. And then the idea is you would take all of those scores, put them together and divide by the cost, and that would reflect basically the benefits per dollar. And that allows us to basically measure, two projects that are delivering the same amount of benefits. If one costs half of what the other does, then you would obviously like to fund the one that costs less and be able to bring another project into the portfolio. Next slide. This is just sort of a quick review of some of the methodology. I'm not going to go deeply into this, but we would essentially, and this is just to kind of give you an example of how we're using data and analysis to do the scoring. For the reduction in fatalities and serious injuries, as an example, we would pull the data from the last 5 years on a particular road section, figure out how many fatalities and injuries, serious injuries there had been, look at what the project does in terms of addressing the conditions that contribute to those crashes that cause injuries and fatalities. Use that information as a crash modification factor, which would essentially enable us to project the reductions in serious injuries and fatalities that would result from the project's implementation. And that would basically be the score, is the number of injuries and fatalities reduced. If it was a transit project, you would essentially do those same steps, but then translate that into a rate. So you might say for every 100,000 miles of travel on this road, there is 1 fatality and 1 serious injury. We anticipate that the transit project is actually going to pull 30 million miles of travel off the road, with people substituting trips in to the transit out of vehicle travel. And you'd be able to just do the math that if it's 1 death and serious injury for every 100,000, it's X number for every 30 million, and that would give you a score for the transit project. Next slide. On safety, this is really just using the same methodologies we would for the overall measures. For instance, whether if a project increases access to jobs, there are now, instead of 200 jobs within a 30-minute travel distance, there are 300 jobs. There are 100 jobs and within 10 minutes instead of 50 jobs. This would break out the portion of that actually applies just to disadvantaged communities and use that as the score. Next slide. So we are in the process of reaching out to stakeholders and getting feedback on this. We are moving quickly to do that because we have a short time schedule that we're working on. We will be shortly trying to develop materials that communicate what this looks like, and then hope to launch a process essentially in January. Next slide.
Sorry, can we stop right there?
Sure.
That's the question. You're saying that you're in the process right now, reach out to stakeholders? If so, what stakeholders have you reached out to?
Sure. We've been doing stakeholder outreach in September and October, and now we have held webinars for all the counties, a couple different webinars for the counties, for MPOs. We've talked to several municipalities. We've talked to people in the legislature. That's I think mostly what the outreach has been thus far. The MPOs as well. Did I mention that? And if we can go to the next slide, I'll give you a sense of sort of where this is all going. So as you know, our intention is to announce the amount of money available for expansion projects. We would like to open the portal in January for applications, which means we would be announcing an amount of money available. And as you know, if you've been following the current CTP, money is rather scarce at this point. So the first year, we are basically proposing a no money trial. So this would basically allow us to test this process and allow stakeholders to submit applications and understand how the scoring works and understand how the process works, what data is needed to submit projects properly, and basically do a trial run in the first year where we would have the opportunity to sort of test the process, get feedback from stakeholders, make any adjustments, and then actually have a real round of funding when that funding is actually available. But this slide gives you a sense of what the flow would be in terms of the kind of a normal process. We would open the portal in January. Projects would need to be submitted by mid-February. We would review applications and do the scoring up until May. That ranking would be published in the draft CTP in September. Through the CTP tour, we would get public input on those rankings, and then the the secretary would take that to a public commission of some kind, announce the final list of projects. Those would be submitted to the General Assembly with the final CTP in January. The General Assembly would do what they do, and then we would have the capacity, as I mentioned earlier, to review what the process has been, basically sort of May through July. Do stakeholder outreach, get a better understanding of people's experience with the process, any suggested revisions, take that public input in September through November, amend the process, and then come out with announce a revised process with all of the sort of education and outreach and other things so that people could understand what had changed, what remained the same, and be prepared for January when the portal would open again. So that concludes my presentation. I hope I have stayed somewhere within the time limits, but I'm happy to take questions and talk further about any of those aspects.
Jeff, it's John Laria. Thank you very much for, that's a lot, obviously. Thank you for racing through it. I mean, on one hand, I feel like there are enormous stakes here and I will have 1,000 questions. On the other, as soon as you said no money trial, it sort of changed my perspective. So I'm trying to, you're saying that in the first year, you would ask people to go through this process as if it were a real process, knowing that at the end it was going to lead to nothing other than testing the process?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
And that's similar. I mean, the Chapter 30 process, I think people have some projects that, are probably, fairly ready to be engaged in such a process to be submitted. So, I certainly understand that it's less enticing to go through the work to submit things, but it does allow people to be better prepared once the process is a real process with real money.
Let me ask one other question, and I'll turn it over if people have other questions. So if for what we're concerned about, right, our stuff, right, the MTA, core service, et cetera, how do we interact with this process? Are applications going to be made into that process by MTA or by, help me connect like the project scope that we're interested in and the area that we're interested in to the revised funding ranking. Sorry.
So anything that is state of good repair would not go through here. So that's the first thing to remember. So it's basically capacity expansion, service expansion projects that are between 5 million and 400 million. So if there are projects that sort of fall into that, MTA would has its own list of projects that I'm sure it is looking at and has prepared to submit to this. Certainly, I'm sure Holly is going to be talking to people about what those are and how those are determined. But it also means that other entities, cities, counties, MPOs can submit projects in addition, and those will be considered and ranked along with the projects submitted by the modes at MDOT.
Okay, let me, yes. Yeah.
So can you give me an example of projects that were recommended in this draft CTP for Chapter 30? And then also, in addition to that, tell me who was allowed to submit Chapter 30 projects previously, now that you're opening up to independent cities, municipalities, and the whole nine. What's the comparison there?
So the only additions that I think have are MPOs and transit agencies. So lots entities basically. Municipalities can submit under the current Chapter 30 process. Counties can submit under the current Chapter 30 process. The modes can submit under the current Chapter 30 process. And I'm sorry, what was your first question again?
When you say state governments, you're talking about anybody in state government can now submit a project, any other state agency?
Theoretically, yes. We expect that mainly to be the MDOT modes.
Yeah, mainly the modes. You wanted to repeat your other
And
part.
then the first part of my question was for this draft CTP, what projects did you all recommend under Chapter 30?
So there is a Chapter 30 scoring list that is in the appendix of the CTP. And I'd have to go back and reference which of those projects appeared with funding, and largely, obviously, this round was around where funding was removed from a number of projects or delayed. So I think there's not a close correlation in this round because there was not new funding.
So there was no new funding, so we didn't recommend any Chapter 30 And
There,
this,
there are Chapter 30 projects that have been scored basically last year, the previous year. There are several that have been sort of in the queue for a while and have scores. There has not been a close correlation between the scores those have received and whether they were funded in the CTP. And I think that's one of the things we are trying to make clearer and a closer connection with this process.
Aaron?
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation. I mean, as I've listened to it and looked at it, I mean, this kind of feels like a grant program. I mean, a very similar approach, I think, that you're taking, if I'm not mistaken, maybe a little slight iteration thereof. You know, I think if for entities that are potentially looking to enter this process, maybe that's what you do, is you create more of like a notice of funding and kind of clarify these points that you're building into this process on how it's going to be ranked and everything else. So I mean, I may be wrong, but this feels like you've structured a grant process here.
I think there are definitely some parallels, and we will be putting together materials and doing pre-briefings for people about sort of how the scoring process works, how to submit projects for consideration, what data are needed to be able to score them correctly. So I do think there are some parallels.
Thank you.
Mike, yeah, so I just want to know, what already do you have that are prioritized projects? And do you have a listing of them for this commission, to be able to see or review, by its cost, from the highest cost to the lowest cost?
No, we don't have, because this would be the first year. What we would have after running this process in the trial year would be a ranked list of projects where this commission and anybody else could see basically what the project is, how much it costs, how it scores, and where that project ranks compared to the other projects that have been submitted.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Arnie and then Mike.
One question that I have is like your ranking, of course, if we go back to slide number 24, I don't know if I understood that correctly. And how you rank, like, for transit, reduction in vehicle miles traveled. My question is, how is that being evaluated? Maybe I didn't understand correctly, because if people go from a car to transit, that would automatically increase safety, basically. And if I read this correctly, if there's fewer miles, that would give a higher score, but is there some kind of a consideration if people move to transit that would increase safety in general because of the fact that transit is safer than people driving on their own? I just want to make sure that transit is appropriately scored, for that matter, and that it doesn't get disadvantaged. So maybe I didn't understand it. Maybe you can explain a little more how that works. And that might in general for transit, because if you use transit, of course, also for other purposes, if people move to transit, it has a lot of benefits. I don't know how that will be counted in your scoring.
Sure. So I think transit's benefits are reflected in a couple places in the scoring. With respect to safety in this particular slide, let's say I was driving all the time and then there's new service and I switch over to transit. So the miles that I would have been driving, let's say I drove, 3,000 miles a year. If there was one serious injury for every 3,000 miles that were driven on that road, you would basically, my switching off, that one person switching off would reduce the number of serious injuries by one. And so you do that basically for every rider. So you project, there are going to be 4,000 riders. Here's how much driving that would have represented, and here is the rate of crashes and serious, fatalities and serious injuries that would have happened if they had been driving, and that's what the transit would get credited with. I think the other places that transit probably will benefit are, one of the criteria is about whether you reduce single occupant vehicle trips. Obviously, greenhouse gas transit is helpful for that. The other safety measures, just trying to think of what the other measures are. The land use measure in terms of the promoting land uses that reduce the stress on the transportation system. So there are a number of criteria where transit will, the benefits of transit are reflected in the criteria and the scoring.
Yeah, my confusion was then vehicle miles traveled, these are like personal vehicle miles traveled, these are not transit vehicle miles.
Yes, I'm sorry, that it is reflecting how much you reduce the personal auto vehicle miles of travel, yes.
Go to Mike and then see if we can sort of wrap up. I'm not exactly sure what that means at this point, this discussion, let's move on to the next, but let's Mike, go ahead and ask whatever you.
No, I'll be quick. I sort of echo Aaron's comments when I heard all this. It sort of sounds like a grant program, and I'm chuckling because we're asking people to do all this work and then it's sort of like a head fake, we're really not gonna fund anything. So it would be nice if you at least put some enticement in there to fund one or two of these. Yet you said federal discretion. Another quick question, that was more of a comment, but the federal discretionary funds, are those in-kind dollar matches or are they hard dollar matches usually, do you know?
For federal discretionary funds, meaning federal grant funds, those are generally hard matches.
Yeah, Celeste, go ahead, please.
I think kind of piggybacking, I had two quick questions about, so after the year one kind of dry run, is there gonna be another opportunity for feedback? Cause I can imagine once we see examples, like the metrics, may be some questions, there may be some data questions and how that may put burden on smaller jurisdictions versus larger jurisdictions. So I was just wondering what after year one, what's after that?
Absolutely. I think that is one of the, obviously, let me say, we would prefer to have money for this, but fiscal realities are what they are. But yes, in order to try to sort of prepare ourselves for the eventuality that we do have money available for new capacity, and to be more transparent about how that money is allocated and how the scoring is related to projects that ultimately end up funded, we do want to basically get feedback on this process, have people have some experience with this process. I'm not that concerned if we don't get a ton of applications, frankly, because I think with 10 or 15, we can get some good experience using this and applicants can get some good experience. And, if you're a jurisdiction sitting there thinking I would submit 5 projects normally, I might just submit 1 so that I knew how to get those 5 ready for the subsequent rounds when money is available. Just to get the experience of submitting 1, understanding how it works, understanding what kind of data you need, and so forth.
Right, and obviously this has provoked a lot of interest and I'm also trying to manage our time, but I don't want to cut people off. Tony, you haven't spoken, and then DeAndre, maybe you can have the last question, sort of.
Just a quick comment about equity and looking at, specifically with transit and providing improved access to jobs. I would suggest also access to educational institutions and other opportunities around education for the public. When we are thinking about equity and transit, that is always a major point.
Thank you.
I would like to suggest that maybe you pull in some jurisdictions that have had difficulty with chapter 13 to maybe sit around a task force to help you understand some of the challenges we've had with chapter 30. I think that you're gonna have a very difficult time having entities fill out an application or go for something that seems like a grant, knowing that they're not going to get anything out of it. The resources are just not available to entities to be able to put that kind of time into something to get no return on. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. I think that's a good suggestion, and it's certainly, what we've tried to do with some of the initial outreach is to give people an opportunity to comment on this and to look at it and how it works without obviously going through the entire process. And we will definitely do more of that as part of the follow-up from sort of the initial trial, is to not only talk with people who had experience using it, but take that information to a broader set of people and get their feedback as well.
Let me just, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was just gonna, sorry, I was just gonna say, I mean, if this thing walks like a duck, talks like a duck, I mean, it's a duck, it's a grant. And most of these jurisdictions, they know how to apply for grants. So I would encourage you in messaging to the stakeholders that you kind of pitch it in that form, because that's how they'll be able to understand it very easy without trying to create, let's say, this is a whole new process. Well, really, we're kind of structuring a grant that to be able to prioritize these types of new projects. So it becomes less daunting, because a lot of these organizations, they have a capacity, they have an understanding on how to apply for grant programs at the federal and state level. So I would just encourage that in your outreach, that's all.
So we need to move along. I don't want to leave this hanging. I guess remember the predicate for this is that everybody hates Chapter 30 as it's currently drafted. And the Train Commission addressed this, and it was like the first item in everybody's list. Whatever else we're doing, Chapter 30 has to change. And then the department said, yep, we're on that. We agree with you. We agree with you before the Train Commission was convened, and we're going to change it. So that's the process that you're seeing here. That's the broader context. Jeff, does this then require you to legislatively change? Chapter 30 obviously refers to a law. So are you going to be looking for legislative change in the 25 legislative session around this?
I don't know yet. I think that's possible, but we definitely can move ahead with these without those changes, particularly this year where there are not funds on the line. So we will be moving forward, and I can't really speak to whether there's going to be a legislative effort around this or not. But I do appreciate your comments, just in terms of context. Our strong understanding is that people are not happy with the current process, that it really is not transparent. It's not clear sort of how it relates to whether projects in fact end up being funded. And we're trying to remedy that and trying to make it very clear the values that we're pursuing and the kinds of projects that score well and why they score well, and show that those that do, there's a close connection between that and actually getting funding in the CTP.
Well, I guess my last comment would be, well, an observation would be, you certainly have swung the pendulum back hard in the other direction. I mean, this is an enormous sort of process you've set up here, which maybe is the way to do it. I am concerned about the process and how we can contribute to it, but less concerned if it's really a year away before it matters. And as long as there's an opportunity along that year to redo some of the public input, like DeAndrea suggests, others people have suggested it, I guess I'm willing to sort of wait and see what happens. But other than that, I'm not sure that I'd be comfortable today going, yep, this looks good to me, because you've given us a ton of information. It's not your fault. It's an enormous amount of information in a short time. So I'm just trying to figure out, what constructively can we do in this kind of 2-year cycle. Don, do you have any thoughts about this? I mean, I'm sure you've been looking at it as well.
We did have a chance to review this earlier, and we've shared some comments with the department. I think all the comments here, you got on the paper that represent some of the questions we've asked as well.
I mean, I'd be comfortable, we do have great staff at BMC. I'd be comfortable with, BMC has some of the, I'm sure you're reviewing this for all sorts of reasons. I'd be comfortable with you providing comments on behalf of what you think the commission's concerned about, plus what you've heard here, and maybe give the commission another opportunity outside this process, outside today, to weigh in. I just don't know I don't know what the hard deadlines are in the process by which, if you don't give input by this date, this thing happens. And again, in view of this sort of unusual dry run year, I just don't know how much, if the juice is worth the squeeze, frankly, to evaluate a process that is probably gonna get reevaluated after the first year anyway. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Alright.
We can do that.
Okay, we do need to move on for time. Jeff, is there anything you want to say in response to what you've heard?
Yeah, I totally understand that this is a lot of information. If I was to just come here and present the existing Chapter 30 process, it would sound a lot like this. So I think there's, this isn't sort of entirely fresh new system. It is an amendment to the existing system with some significant changes like the every other year. But I guess I would only say that is that I think it is in its substance not that different from the Chapter 30 process as it currently stands. Hopefully more transparent, hopefully better communicated, but there are reams of information on Chapter 30 on how to apply on all those things, and I think that's just not as transparent when you sort of look at this fresh as opposed to sort of changing the existing process.
One last question, Holly, I don't mean to put you on the spot, I'm just gonna, since you lead a transit agency, are you giving input involved in this discussion to think about ways in which the scoring system, for example, or other things is equitable with regard to transit and will allow you to make potential proposals? I mean, do you foresee MTA being able to make proposals into this system once it gets up and running?
Yeah, I mean, MTA has been part of the group working with Jeff and his team. I mean, I don't want to put Liz on the spot, but Liz and Kate have been pretty heavily engaged. I know we've kind of tested some of our projects through it, and so yeah, we anticipate. I think at this point, we want to test it out, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think to Jeff's point, we have done some internal tests, but we want to take a look and see how the different projects score. You never really know until you actually run it through it, and so.
Okay. All right, well, let's move on. Jeff, thank you very much, appreciate it.
My pleasure, thank you, appreciate the time.
A short RTP update followed by the origin destination study. Still a lot to do, time is tight, but that's okay. So how are you doing that? Liz? You're doing both of those, are you?
Yeah, they're just gonna roll right into each other. I don't think my confusion is that it's labeled performance updates.
Yeah, it's the wrong.
I'm sorry,
It's the wrong desk.
My mistake.
We have a hard copy of I see we have the OD. Do we have a hard copy of this as well?
They're
The
two
RTPs
together.
At the back of
Yeah, the RTP updates are the last several slides.
So you're gonna do it
So
in
if it's
that order?
okay, if we could reverse the order that.
Yeah, of course,
Run
yeah.
straight through them in ideally 20 minutes.
Do you wanna just start off the hard copy so we can keep going, or Don is,
I got
there he is, sorry. Okay.
Thank you, Don.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so last time we spoke, we looked at a little bit of specifically the demographic information out of the origin and destination survey. You will see some of those graphs from last time presented again. That's just because it doesn't really hang together without the full context, but if I'm moving pretty quickly through some pieces, that's why. So we're gonna talk about our origin and destination survey, how we did it methodologically, what it's saying to us about who people are, where they're going. And then another thing that I'm gonna add is a little bit of information from conversations that customers have had with our customer experience team that's really been out there on that system, talking to a bunch of people. So we'll talk about some of the quantitative, some of the qualitative. In terms of the methodology, we went on to all of our transit modes and we talked to people, administered surveys to people, to a statistically significant sample of people, and talked to them about who they are, where they're going, for what purpose.
et cetera. And we've done that for all of our modes except mobility. It's a little, can't really do an intercept survey on mobility in quite the same way. So we have different measures there. The interviewer administered the questionnaire. We had English and Spanish interviewers available. And you can see in this table how many people we spoke to on each mode. You can see the vast majority of the surveys were administered on local bus. That reflects how many of our trips occur on local bus. So it is proportional pretty much. In terms of key takeaways about the age and gender of our riders, particularly compared to previous surveys, for core modes, our riders were younger than they were in previous surveys, and they were more male than they were in previous surveys. We don't have super good information about why that would be in terms of speculation. That may be some of the ways that the workforce changed in the pandemic, both in terms of which jobs could go remote and also a lot of women leaving the workforce and potentially not going back, right? So we don't know for sure, and stuff is playing out. Commuter bus has the oldest ridership. I think that's sort of due to the types of jobs that are best served, and local bus and light rail have the youngest ridership. One thing I will note about the age demographics, we cannot talk to children without their parents present. So I actually dropped the under 18 demographic out of this altogether. And the reason that I did that is because the only under 18 folks that we were able to talk to were ones that had their parents present. So that was just not representative. And we have things like our youth transit council and other outreach methods to try to make sure that we capture the youth perspective. So the percentage of minority riders on our service, it has increased on all of the modes since the previous survey. And the largest increase was actually on commuter bus. Hispanic and Latino ridership on commuter bus has doubled, and all modes saw double-digit increases in Black and African-American share of ridership, except for local bus. It was high before, it remains high, but on all of the other modes, there was a pretty noticeable shift. In terms of income and language, we did change the cap on what constitutes low income. This is consistent with peers and consistent with the cost of things rising. So now our scale of who's low income starts at 50,000 per year. And all modes except local bus saw an increase in low income riders. 11% of our riders predominantly speak another language at home, although the vast majority of those folks do state that they speak English very well. 5% of all MTA riders speak Spanish at home, which is a big increase from the previous survey and an increase that happened across all of our modes. We'll gloss over this a little bit, but in terms of how people are paying to ride, a lot of people are using the Charm card or the Charm pass on in the app, but how people are actually paying for those passes is really cash at the kiosks and also through the app. Why are people traveling? Like, what's the purpose? Most of the trips either begin or end at home. That makes sense. You're usually going to somewhere from your home or going from somewhere to your home. Pretty reasonable. After that, work. But it's not like work is really close to home as the origin or destination pair. Secondly, it's a big drop because people are also going from their home to shopping, social, worship, that sort of thing at really high rates. And particularly on our commuter modes, on MARC and on commuter bus, we are seeing that work to home trip in the peak hour sort of losing some of its pull. In terms of connecting from one mode to another for our core modes and MARC riders, there were fewer transfers that people were connecting. Our service didn't change a whole bunch, so I don't think we would expect that this is because there's suddenly less need for people to transfer because the service has changed. And I think there's just less tolerance for transfers at this point, which is interesting for us to know when we're planning our service. For our core modes, people really walk to transit to get to and from it. Less than 1% of our riders use a bike or a scooter to access the MTA service except for Mark, where people really are riding their bikes to Mark stations at a higher rate than our other modes. And when we asked people, how would you have traveled if the transit wasn't available? A fair number of people say they wouldn't take the trip, they just wouldn't do it, which is a little scary to think about. But the most common answer was ridership, ride sharing apps or taxi. So for a lot of people, if they can't catch a bus, that means they have to pay triple, quadruple to take a Lyft or an Uber. Interestingly, in terms of the other options that people have or don't have, 86% of our core mode riders, so that's light rail, metro, and core bus, do not have a car available for their trip. However, on the commuter modes, on commuter bus and on Mark, most of the riders do have a car available as the other trip option. In terms of where we're going, the origin and destination.
Can you go back one slide?
Yes.
The third bullet, 18% bullet on the bottom. Maybe you didn't ask the question, but, and then what would have happened? I mean, do we know they would not have made the trip?
Yeah.
Does that mean the
It
trip was
means-
inherently optional and they're just gonna forego an optional
I
trip?
mean,
Or
but is it optional to socialize, to go to church, to, you know, make it to your medical appointment, right? Like, people are using our service to get to life's needs. And if they're unable to do that, that just means that some of the things that help them like live a good life are unavailable to them. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I understand. That's the reasonable answer.
Yeah.
It
And
just
so-
caught my attention.
So they may, you know, they may still live if they don't make it to the grocery store that day, right? But it's an unpleasant prospect that 1 in 5 times, if MTA wasn't available, people would just be not accessing the things that they need to do. In terms of where we are going physically, on core bus, 53% of our core bus trips, that 50 million-ish trips per year, begin and end within Baltimore City, which makes sense. That's the core of our system. But that does mean that almost half of our trips have a trip end outside of Baltimore City, which was really interesting to us. That's primarily Baltimore County, although there are some in Anne Arundel and Howard counties as well. In terms of where people are coming from, Northwest Baltimore, Southeast Baltimore, and the I-83 corridor really remain the zip codes, because this is at the zip code level, that show up as the places that people are coming from. Maybe that's really where all of the demand is, or maybe that's where our service is good enough to meet people's needs, so that's where they're writing it, right? The top origin and destination pairs in our system were people traveling sort of broadly within Northwest Baltimore. You can see the metro service, and then some of the big core bus lines up in the CityLink lines up in Northwest Baltimore can explain a lot of that travel demand, and it's a big area. Northwest Baltimore City and West Baltimore, so traveling in that sort of general West Baltimore area, downtown and kind of the Charles Village area, that sort of north-south central movement, sort of near a north-south corridor study is a really big origin and destination pair. Northwest Baltimore City and Charles Village, so that kind of cross-town type of pattern, and then downtown and Northwest Baltimore City. So you really do see a lot of those origins in Northwest. In terms of light rail, it is interesting, our top 5 trip pairs all have one end outside of Baltimore City. You can see that there's this really strong pattern of Lutherville and Simonian to downtown. There's Hunt Valley to the sort of Woodbury, Druid Hill Park area. There's Linthicum to downtown. There's BWI to downtown, and then BWI to South Baltimore. So all of our top trips have only one end in Baltimore City, which was really interesting.
Liz, what do you make of number 2 in the presence of Druid Hill Park? Is there some particular reason that Druid Hill Park would be a significant?
Yeah, so that's kind of aggregating several zip codes that are near that Woodbury stop, and also people often sort of catch a bus. So I think it's just showing that there's this need to get sort of south and then west. And people are cobbling together a lot of different transfers.
Does it
to
include
make
Cold
it
Spring
happen.
Lane there?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah. But in terms of this, but because it's on the zip code level, we haven't really been able to get into the very specific origins and destinations, unfortunately. Riders are on our light rail, and you'll see this for Metro as well. They are more centered around the corridor than they have been in previous studies. There's less park and ride. There's less coming from far afield to access the light rail. It is serving the people nearby the service more so than before. In terms of Metro, again, there's this origin and destination pattern that's closer to the Metro line than in previous surveys. And there's a lot of transferring on the Metro. And where these transfers are occurring is primarily to core bus, and it's at Lexington Market, it's at Mondawmin, it's at Rogers Ave. And in terms of the lines that people are transferring to, it's the 85, the 81, and the 87. But even in this mode where there's this big pattern of transfers, fewer transfers than in previous studies. Origins and destinations more centralized around the rail service, 36% transferred. On the commuter modes, the top trip pairs for MARC were Baltimore and DC, Frederick and DC, Odenton and DC, BWI and DC, and then Baltimore and New Carrollton, which was sort of interesting to see. So we've also been doing some market studies for other MARC studies, and this matches sort of what we see is what you'd expect for the travel market to be. But we do think that there are also markets, Baltimore City and points north, that may show up in future surveys, but I still found this interesting. For commuter bus, the sort of Southern Maryland, Waldorf to DC pair is very, very strong for a commuter bus ridership, but so is Frederick to College Park, Upper Marlboro to DC, Wason's Corner, Pendel area to DC, and Annapolis to DC. I think these sort of point-to-point commuter type services remaining really centered on DC makes sense for the types of jobs that have been supported by these services, the outreach that's been done between federal employers and these services and their employees. So it makes sense. You can see the gravity of it as a destination for these modes at least. So I'm gonna kind of transition from the quantitative data that we pulled out of the origin and destination survey over to what's that experience like for customers once they're on our service. And this is gonna be really focused on core bus, because again, that's really our heavy hauling mode, and that's really where the outreach has focused. So our Office of Customer Experience has had approximately 1,300 in-depth conversations with riders. Their director, Roxana, is online today, so if we have any questions for more about the relatively new Office of Customer Experience, she's here, she can speak to it. But they have as their mission to elevate and amplify the voices of our riders by actively collaborating with riders, operators, and staff to co-create solutions that will enhance and transform the rider experience. So that's sort of what's underlying this, to really understand what people are experiencing on our service. In terms of the issues that our riders say to us, the inconsistency of arrivals, I think, something we know and track in our performance metrics, but it bears out when talking to people. Frequency, this bore out in our Be More Bus study too, when we ask people, what do you want from the bus? They say it should come more. The transit app prediction, how accurate that can be when people are really depending on that to make a bus and not have to wait for 30 minutes. That really needs to be right on. They have spoken to us about operator behavior, cleanliness, good and bad, overcrowding, which is of course related to some of those other frequency and performance things.
How are the majority of people communicating that online or calls?
No, our Office of Customer Experience has what they call rider talkers,
Right.
who they're on the system talking to riders.
Right.
So these are conversations that are meant to not feel like interviews, they're meant to feel like conversations. I've heard some audio of them, it's pretty interesting. And they're just pulling these issues out, really treating them as qualitative data, tagging what they're seeing and hearing. It's a good and important effort. But people have also said really positive things about the overall system. We have heard from our customer experience team that sometimes, they're on the system, they're happy to be using it, they're happy it's there. And once you start digging a little deeper, you hear some of those issues. But You also do hear a lot of positives about the overall system. You hear a lot of positive interactions that people have with their operators. You hear about people who are really happy with the transit app. You've heard a lot of things about improvement in cleanliness and improvement in the real-time information. So it's not all doom and gloom. In terms of actual quotes of the positive experiences and the issues encountered, you will see on here, there are things about nice drivers, informative drivers, knowledgeable. The transit app being super helpful to people when they're trying to get where they need to go. And also, like I said, improvements in cleanliness. The issues encountered, you know, there's some acknowledgement that rider behavior can have trash on trains and buses become an issue. And also, you know, we're looking into the things that we can do in terms of cleaning our vehicles on a more frequent basis, the stuff where we can intervene. And then you do hear a lot about people just, when the buses don't come as much as they would hope, having challenges getting where they need to go when they need to get there. And similar issue with reliability. So that's what I still have to go into the RTP stuff, but any questions or discussion on this?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, I was
One
looking
question.
at something.
So one, thank you for the massive amount of data that you guys collect. I'm just wondering, I don't know if it's a question for you or for Holly or others, but how do you think about using that data for advocacy purposes, either local jurisdiction, state? You just collect a lot of data that could either be helpful in some of these budgetary conversations around even some of the issues that you encounter, or positive reinforcement why investments make sense. I'm just wondering if you can give a second on how you use it.
I mean, I can jump at it and Liz, feel free. I mean, so we use data in so many different ways, right? So like the main reason we get the origin and destination data is building our schedules, right? So like building where the routes are going, how they're being informed, how we're getting people to and from. Like we see that West Baltimore and Northwest, like the need there, and so making sure we have the right levels of service. That's the main purpose of it. We have and will continue to also use the data to, you know, inform decisions about equity, right? So we have equity metrics that we use and that we weigh when we're determining capital projects and where operating dollars are gonna go. And we've shared that with the General Assembly. You know, a couple years ago, I testified in favor of the Fair Fares Act and being able to use the data that we had that showed that, you know, the majority of our riders are low income. So raising the fares beyond the $2 at the time was gonna be really problematic for our riders. And so, you know, we use it in those variety of ways, and we're happy to make it available to anyone who wants to take a look at it.
Aaron, please.
Yeah, on the transit app, do you also solicit feedback from people on the transit app for these types of surveys? Do you do a survey on the transit app?
Do we use the transit app to get surveys out? So for this one, no, and that's because this is pretty methodologically strict, right? Like this is required by the federal government. We use it for some of the FTA equity analyses, that sort of thing. So this really needs to be done by a scientific surveyor who has pretty strict methodological things. We have done advertisement on the transit app for like the Be More Bus study and other things, and I think that's pretty cool and it's been well received. But for this one, it's sort of its own animal.
So, and I wanna note, so when I talked a couple of meetings ago about transit app and making Transit Royale free for all of our riders, as part of that contract, it also allows us to do surveys on the transit app. So if you use transit app and like you answer all the questions that they ask, like we get that data, like they feed that to us, and we're able to do some more personalized surveys as part of that contract. So it is one way out of many. I will say, you know, one of the things, there's a lot of folks who use transit app, but we also do still have a lot of riders who do not have access to a phone. And so we have to just be careful when we're weighing that information that it's not representative of all of our riders. Absolutely.
Like,
So I love this data, it's super robust and rich, and you could cross tab it forever and be fascinated. I know we can't do that in this meeting. I think one thing that stood out to me that from my recollection, it's not gonna be in the O&D survey, but maybe you can capture on the customer experience side, is you made a point, it was on a couple, that people's origin and destination are closer to kind of the spine of those major routes. And so, I mean, it begs the question in there, you know, have they presidentially moved in the last, year or two, was transit access a component of that decision? And then same with employment, right? Did you choose a job because of transit access? And I think just trying to figure out how we can get to that could really help with advocacy, but just telling a broader story of how residential and employment density both matter to transit functionality and success.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anybody else? Should we move on to the RTP?
All right. So as this group is very aware, the Central Maryland Regional Transit Plan has a 2025 update that we are embarking on and plan to engage you in. So the understanding of what we're trying to accomplish here is to update the legislatively required Central Maryland Regional Transit Plan, the RTP. We want to document the advancements that we have made since 2020 and revise it where necessary. We have made advancements. Revisions are necessary already from looking at it. There was a really long list of corridors of opportunity in the RTP, and there's going to be a focus this time on prioritization and phasing, really thinking about what's appropriate for those corridors, what do they need to move the needle, and then phasing prioritization, stuff like that. We have been talking through, as you all have pointed out, a lot of ways that we have gathered data over the last couple of years, and we're trying to really maximize those previously done analyses, as opposed to embarking on a whole big new analysis. We have also encountered in our outreach efforts over the past year or so a growing kind of fatigue with the public of all of these touch points with all of these big projects. And so what we are not going to do is go back out to the public like, hey, what should the goals be? Big, broad discussion. Everyone is very tired of that. So we're really focusing on BRTC coordination, sharing information with our partners and the people who are engaged in our implementation team, and kind of reporting out in an effort for accountability to implementation of the RTP with the public, and reporting out the ways in which these stakeholder processes are refining our thinking. And from a schedule standpoint, we expect to complete work by October 2025, as is required of us. All right. So from a structure standpoint, we have an internal project management team. An important member of that team is here with us today. Albert Geiniengel is our internal manager. He's our assistant manager for project development, and is going to be really driving the internal team. We also are going to have an internal steering committee within MTA to make sure we're vetting this through all of the necessary stakeholders as you get from big, broad plan towards implementation and prioritization. More and more stakeholder feedback from the people who are going to be expected to implement is really, really important. And then, of course, BRTC is going to be a big part of the mix here too. We are looking at that schedule of meetings that we discussed today and rethinking this a little. And if there's 6 meetings of the BRTC next year, we'll have to think about how to have all of these useful touch points, either in a condensed number or engaging with working groups or whatever the case may be. But in general, what we're embarking on right now is that documentation of RTP progress, updating the market and demand analysis, looking at how people travel has changed, where they live has changed, to your point, where the work has changed. So we're gonna be updating some of that demand analysis and getting input on the corridor confirmation and prioritization. So in a BRTC meeting in January, we would expect that we could speak through those 2 bullet points with the sort of yellow arrow, and then have a conversation and get your input on the corridor confirmation and prioritization. And the subject matter follows the same sort of format for the other meetings. At the next time we speak together, we think that we'll sort of present out the corridor confirmation and prioritization, and have a conversation and get input on the beginnings of the mode suitability assessment. And then sort of as we go through, we're thinking we'll sequentially introduce subjects, get feedback on them, finalize them sort of through the year. We will work together to make this plan work with the schedule as it
Yeah,
finalizes.
and just to be clear, I think, you know, the schedule needs to be discussed. We'll see where that ends up. I was just trying to say to the commission earlier that we want to get that schedule right, so not
Totally.
overburden people, but also to make sure that we're getting our job done. We have a statutory obligation to engage on the RTP.
Yeah.
Which is, you know, one of the reasons why this is happening. Liz, I'm just gonna ask you one quick question and hopefully we can move on. Can you just remind everybody what the point of the RTP is? Once it's done, so what? What does it do?
What an existential question.
Well, there are a lot of existential questions lately, so go right ahead.
Yeah, okay. So the idea of the RTP as distinct from something like Be More Bus, which has this kind of narrower view. The point of the RTP is to lay out a longer term, 25+ year vision for what transit could do region-wide. So it's not just focused on the core service area, it's focused on the whole region, and it's meant to lay out the big, broad vision. We do think that the 2020 plan was quite successful in laying out a big, broad vision and speaking to what the goals are, what transit could accomplish, et cetera. And what we're hoping to do with this update and with future updates is to kind of zoom in from there on and add detail to the pieces about how does this vision become future projects, become plans, become actual capital program over time, right? So
We'll revisit the structure and legal issues, et cetera. We can certainly wait till January to do that, but thank you. Other questions about this? I do want to move on. Thank you for that preview. The commission obviously looks forward to being involved in that process.
Okay.
Okay,
thanks, everybody.
thank you.
Thank you.
So we're gonna move on to a presentation on the, from our consultants about the authority study. Let me say one really important thing while they're getting organized to do this, because I think it will frame the discussion. You've seen in your packets, and I think was sent in advance, I don't know, but it's in your packets. Just looking at Ashley's headshot there. It's like, you have seen the study and you'll now hear about it. We are not at the end going to discuss and vote upon a preferred outcome. It's way more complicated than that. I don't think we really have the resources to do that. There are just so many factors. I just want to remind everybody how this got started in the first place. The Train Commission had in its original configuration and now in its revised configuration, a charge to look at regional authorities. The Train Commission did not get to that in its first year of work, and then it was reconfigured. Train Commission, to my knowledge, has not met for the last 11 months and is supposed to do a mandatory report by I want to say January 1st, something like that, it's fairly imminent. So we, not knowing what was going to happen, and because we have a real interest in this, and we had access to the consultants who had done this work for the BMC in the group that Tony Bridges chaired, which led to the legislation, which led to us, right? We said, let's just continue to carry this ball, because at least we know if we do it, it will get done. At least, you know, the analysis will get done because we have control over it. And I think in a way, I'm viewing us as providing sort of a service to the Train Commission and to the other interested parties here. So I think you should ask questions, certainly, we should refine, and I'm not saying that the presentation shouldn't change or that, you know, there won't be that these slides are the slides that are kind of going to people, because people should ask questions and see where we end up. But as you're doing it, please don't get yourself in the mindset of, you know, I prefer this one and John's gonna make me vote at the end of the meeting, because that's just not where we are. I think that's probably enough because I think it'll affect the way we, so I want you to ask good questions to help refine the analysis. But I don't think we're headed here for the idea that we're gonna sort of say, that's the one we think you should do, because there are just so many factors.
And thank you. So my name's Bethany Whitaker. I'm with the consultant team. And I was actually gonna say the same thing. Like, I'm gonna go, I know there's been a lot of information at this meeting. We're gonna add to that. I'm gonna go through the slides pretty quickly, but I think the main thing is we'd love to hear from you. Hopefully you've had a chance to look at them. It is a long agenda. I'm gonna get started. Fred's gonna jump in. I'm gonna talk about governance first, and Fred's gonna talk about funding second, but we could have flipped. We would, they're really chicken and egg. They both belong, they go right together. So just as a reminder, the problem that we're trying to solve here is something we've been working on for a long time. BRTC is already taking an important step to that, but it's making sure the Baltimore region has a say in how transit service is funded and operated and managed in the Baltimore region. We're also trying to modernize and then also increase funding for transit. So I'm gonna start with a peer review, and again, I'm gonna walk quickly through this. I think many of you have seen this before, but there is sort of a continuum of ways transit agencies are configured and governed in the United States. Many are part of a city or a county or a state, like Montgomery County, Prince George's County, or it could be a city. The city of Charlotte runs their own transit system. And that works great if you want to cross jurisdictional lines. That's often where you move into a regional transit authority. Oftentimes these are independent, many times they're independent. They raise their own money. They have a sales tax that they collect, or sometimes a property tax. Most of the ones that, and then there's regional transit authorities that have a strong tie to a state government, and they get a lot of money from the state. And a big difference between these two tends to be about timing and geography. And a lot of the fast-growing cities like Phoenix, Denver, Nashville just passed a big transit tax on Tuesday. They tend to be the fast-growing cities that are kind of catching up. And a lot of the legacy cities on the East Coast, including Chicago, or Chicago's not on the East Coast, but they have older systems. They're closer to their states, and they receive more money with their states. Most of those transit agencies also have a shared governance, right? So they have a board, the region sits on the board, the state sits on the board, and the state has a big say in how that transit agency is governed. Then there are also a handful of organizations that are planning and funding oriented that either collect and or distribute money. There's two examples that we just noted here. One is the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, which collects and distributes money both that they collect regionally, but also from the state. And then also the Wake Transit Plan, which is in Raleigh, North Carolina. They passed a transit tax in 2016. They collect that money and then they distribute it to the existing transit operators. So these are some of the models that we looked at when we were going through this study. These are the big kind of transit agencies on the East Coast. This is a snapshot. We put this here to show you how much money the state is paying in each of these and how much the locals are contributing. This is data from 2022, which is a little bit of an off year because there was still COVID relief funding in those cases. So, and sometimes the state paid a little bit less. But the main point is that in some cases, the locals, especially in the case of the MBTA and SEPTA, less than 10% of their funds comes from local agencies. MTA and New Jersey Transit are the only ones where locals pay zero. This is sort of like directly, everybody pays sales tax and property tax and things like that. MTA is the only one without a board or some sort of formal governance structure that sits over that. So just, I think these are the key findings. I've mentioned most of these. I wanted to also say that this idea of soft power is something that can be really powerful and make a big difference. I think the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission is an interesting organization. They do have a lot of influence and a lot of authority and a lot of power. They would be an interesting group to talk to depending on what steps you take next. I would encourage that. So just moving to the governance models, just the first step, everything that we're proposing and talking about requires that MDOT changes, right? We've had a lot of conversations today, or you've seen a lot of presentations, and a lot of the way that the Transportation Trust Fund and the way that transportation works in the state of Maryland is multimodal. There's a lot of good things about that. It works well in many cases, but it does mean, and I think the data plays out a little bit that transit hasn't maybe gotten the money or the care or the attention that it deserves. And the Baltimore region certainly feels like it has not gotten the money and the care and the investment that it deserves. And so we would need to break that model in order to carve out a portion for transit funding and governance in the Baltimore region. And so regardless of what you do, that is an important step. That's a difficult step. That is a step that is really gonna break the way things work today. And so that is part, because what we need to do in all cases is to say to the state of Maryland, this is, or the funding source, here's how much we're going to give to transit in Baltimore region, and set that aside and make that clear and commit that. And that does not happen today. And I think that's part of the frustrations and some of the challenges that have occurred over time. So we have these three models. I think Fred and Gwen, my colleague who came a couple of times ago, walked through these with you. One is we could do an independent RTA. The closest model to that is like a SEPTA, right, in Philadelphia, where they have their own transit agency. They operate independently. The state still gives them a lot of money. And they have a board and they make decisions. They manage the service, they operate the service, people work for SEPTA, and they act as a regional authority. A second one is you can have a regional transit authority that sits with the state. The best example of that is the MBTA in Boston. None of these transit agencies are perfect. I'll put that out there. They all have problems. We can also go into some of these models and try to do a better job, right? Learn from their mistakes, take advantage of what they do. So I'm not recommending we become SEPTA or the MBTA. I'm just saying these are the ways that this could work. And so in that case, there would be a board above MTA. The state would still have a lot of control and authority over that agency, but it would have a board that would govern it. They would still have a clear budget that they would receive every year, both for operating and capital. They would make their own decisions about spending that. And then the region could contribute to that MTA, that independent authority. So then we have the third option is a transit commission. So it could be just like the BRTC, or maybe it's a different one. And one of the big differences between the way that you function today and what you would function, how you could function, is that you collect funds. And you have some sort of taxing authority, or you have some fees, or you collect some money in some ways, and then you decide how to invest in that. You could invest that in the MTA, you could invest it in lots, but that would be something that the Transit Commission would decide to do. And I think that I just want to point out that if this, for the Transit Commission to work, and I would say for you all to be comfortable, you want MTA to be a separate entity with its own budget and its own board. And you also, because if you're going to give them money, you need to make sure that you know and you have control over where that money goes, right? And so that the idea that MTA has to change or MDOT has to change regardless is fundamental in all of these options. And so I have some slides and we can go over them, or if you all have questions, we can start talking right now. Yeah.
Why don't we start with either preliminary questions from Sue, because I think people have heard enough and have seen enough. They might have some framing questions, or do you mean this or do you mean that? So maybe I'm wrong, but Lester.
I do have one that I'm going back to kind of what I talked about earlier, and only because I know companies are going through this right post-election, where it doesn't mean you do something different, because a lot of these things will take years and they've got long pull through to happen, but the how you go about it and what your expectations are impacted by the recent election that we had. And so I'm wondering, how does was that a part of the consideration or the analysis, or when you think about what may be doable in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 year horizon, how should we be thinking about that?
So I'm gonna give you my opinion, right? Which is, based on doing a lot of work, I think.
We redid the whole thing since Tuesday.
No, I think that in some ways, it's an opportunity. Regions, if the federal government's gonna shrink or give less money, then the regions step forward, right? And the regions get to be who they wanna be, and maybe that's more taxes or more.
I guess my question is more, I hear what you're saying about the region stepping forward, but municipalities are gonna be faced with budgetary challenges that aren't just on transit, that are in housing, that are in workforce, that are in, there's a lot of constraints that the city of Baltimore, Howard, or others are gonna be faced with, DC. And it may be that we just don't know enough yet, right? We don't know what that looks like, but as I'm thinking about kind of what makes sense and what's doable, that's the piece that in my head is hard to square. Reconciling with the municipalities are gonna be dealing with and where their energies are gonna lie before you get to the state. And that seems like a big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's really complicated in this brand new context, which we still don't know how it's gonna unfold, right? So that is something to be careful about, I think, and the state's always gonna be an important partner regardless. Under all of these models, we need the state. The state is, they've been funding transit for a long time. There are not enough resources, or it would be very difficult to raise those resources to replace that. I think Fred's gonna walk through some numbers. It's $1.2 billion a year that's being spent in the Baltimore region on transit. So raising that locally would be a big lift.
Question about your comparison between the different models you show, like in one of the previous slides. How much money comes from state, how much money comes from somewhere else? My question is, where's the rest of the funds come from? Does it come from government, from the federal government? Because the numbers at some places it's 57%, New Jersey Transit is only 24, and it's not fair, so that's for
Right.
sure, right? So where is that coming from and how is that gap being filled and what's the position in Baltimore then basically with that
Yes.
missing number here? So
That's a good question. So some of it does come from fares and the rest does come from federal government. And so one of the things that we talked about showing those numbers, I can definitely get them for you. What has happened since COVID is that there's been less money's been collected from fares and more has been contributed by the federal government. And what transit agencies are doing right now is trying to get that back to where it was.
Right, so it doesn't mean it's New Jersey Transit, let's say, they get like 75% from the federal government and we get like a lot. We get like 55% from the federal government, say that the fare recovery is only 10% or something like that, right? Or
I have a question about that number, because that's not ringing true for me for MTA,
So it's from NTD. Yeah.
I mean, is that capital and operating? Like, that's just not at all ringing true, because there's very little federal funds in our operating budget. The only ones in the operating budget are for the lots. At this point, there's a little, I mean, maybe in 2022, there was some COVID, but not.
The struggle is there's a lot of COVID money in here.
But
It's
it's
2022.
50% of our budget in 2022.
No, not 50%. I mean, it was probably 300 or 400 million though. I mean, it was sizable and
yeah.
example.
I'm not sure that these numbers are reflective. I mean, I think it's understating the amount of state investment. And like, I wanna just make sure that we're accurately reflecting that the state is putting a ton of money into it.
Right. Yeah, no, and I mean, we can double check our numbers. I wouldn't worry about them too much. I do think 2022 is a difficult year to look at because the feds were putting so much money in and fare revenue was lower. WMATA historically has gotten 40% of its revenue from fares. And so, but in 2022 is much lower. And so we went back and forth on what numbers to show, but we have done, I mean, you all gave us some data and we did do a really exhaustive inventory on how much the state pays.
I do want to be sure that these numbers, and we have more incredibly more numbers still, that they get scrubbed to everybody's satisfaction, at least reasonable satisfaction, because if we're gonna launch this into commerce, so to speak, I don't want it's the thing about everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts, right? So I wanna make sure the facts are, clear and that we're not debating them, because what will distract everybody is if people start fighting about the facts.
So yeah, and I think they're counterintuitive, but I think they're right. I just need to admit, I just
Yeah, I
want to double
understand.
check.
No, so I'm just asking you to, if Holly sees
I was
things.
wondering though, like, does it make more sense not to use 2022? Because it was much more nominal.
We could go back to 2019. Yeah.
We actually discussed that.
Yeah, we talked about that. I mean, 2019 seems a long time ago, but yeah, I think.
I think it would be more reflective of the reality. So that would be my recommendation
Okay, yeah, we could do
is
that.
at least not using 2022. I just don't think it's a good year, and I think
It was a
maybe
bad
that
year.
is, the facts are correct for that year, but
Yep, fair enough.
honestly, even for that year, that still doesn't feel right to me.
Well, it's okay. So Scott Spencer online, Commissioner has a question. I believe, Scott, can you unmute and go ahead, please?
Yeah, thanks a lot, John. So I just wanted to question about the fragmentation of the systems, and particularly how you will see lots being separated from Baltimore Region Transit. I get MARC, I get commuter bus, I get everything else, but just I don't know if it's a semantic thing or a structural thing, but seeing lots separate from Baltimore Regional Transit, I'm just trying to understand that.
Okay, so I think that the question is how with lots?
Yeah, so it's not the structure, there's another slide in there that actually puts up the fragmentation of rethinking MDOT and how you see, keep going.
So keep going.
Okay, I think this
Oh,
one's.
no, this is it. So you say separate entity for MTA, Baltimore Regional Link Services, get that. But then in the next one, you said separately from our trains, get that, commuter bus, get that, and then you say lots, and I'm just trying to understand where lots is not Baltimore Regional Transit.
Right, so it should be statewide lots.
It's the ones outside the.
It's the
Baltimore
ones
region.
outside the Baltimore region.
Scott, does that make sense?
I guess I get that. But I was thinking like Howard County, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel County Service. They're still in the Baltimore region. That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah,
Yes.
they would still be part of the Baltimore region, yeah.
Okay. Other questions so far? I mean, people can interrupt you, sorry.
Of course,
People
yeah.
can interrupt you.
I have one just comment,
Yeah.
because you did say in the interest of thinking about how this is gonna be utilized, not that we're making a decision. I do think that, chart peer systems funding and governance that we've had comments on, other than scrubbing the data, I just think it would be helpful, not knowing who's gonna be seeing this, include Fed and fares, just so that it adds to 100. And then also even adding a line that has total budget, because I think the order of magnitude of the size of these systems.
We can definitely do those.
Is really, something to wrap your head around too.
Yep. Yep, no, I think those are great ideas, yep. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna go, talked a little bit about this already, but this idea of an independent RTA, it would have a general manager, it would have a board of directors. We're saying no more than 50% would be appointed by the state, and at least 50% would be regional. The funding would come from the feds, the state, the fare box, and then some sort of local and regional contribution. And then it would be responsible for operating and managing services, all the services, MTA and lots. And those two systems would go together, right? So MTA would still continue to operate MTA services, the lots would still be part of it. It would be under or a part of this RTA. And some of these things we can play around, this is not exact formula, it's sort of the general thinking. The state-controlled RTA, this, again, you'd have a dedicated general manager like there is today, the board of directors would be new. We're assuming at least half are appointed by MDOT, secretary and the governor, and up to 40% of the seats could come from the region. We expect that the state would control this, it would be their agency. Funding would also come from the region, and they would continue to operate more or less the way that it does today. And the lots would not be a part of this one. The Regional Transit Commission, it would have an executive director who would run the commission. It would have a board of directors. It would raise its own funds. It would have some responsibilities for regional transit planning, like you're doing right now, working with the MDOT MTA on that. But it would take the funds that it collects and it would distribute them either to lots and or to MTA. It could also apply for projects with the federal government. So if there's a grant program, or it could apply to some of the maybe MDOT grants as well, it would be able to initiate and sponsor and get some projects moving. All right, Fred.
Anyway, good to see you all again. And I want to thank our friends at MTA for giving me lots of numbers that we worked with. And obviously the challenge has been set up that we have to make sure that the numbers are the right ones and are well scrubbed. So basically, what we tried to do was inventory spending on transit for the central Maryland, for the core area, how much is being spent, whether it's capital or operating, and then to look toward maybe where some kind of additional regional funding could have the most impact. So we used information that MTA sent to us on the fiscal year 25 operating budget. Now, one of the things that we did that was a little bit different, we took all of MARC and all of commuter bus out of this. And MTA in the previous meeting expressed the notion that MARC is really an integral part of transit for the Baltimore core area, and we should be including that. I think the numbers that were sent basically did an allocation and put about 60% of MARC into those numbers. But what you see here is we've taken 100% of MARC out. So what we've got basically is that that core service, it's taken out funding that goes to different other different modes. It does have the mobility included as well. And you can see that the operating costs, it does include planned service expansions. Those were included in the numbers that we got, I believe. And the lots numbers that were in that budget were level across the 10-year projection. So anyway, it's.
Can MTA, do you know what those, when you just for context, the planned service expansions means what? Like what would have fed that bullet, do you know?
The footnotes were tied to increases in staffing rather than service descriptions. So it's for additional bus service primarily. And MTA, you're glad to add different things. I couldn't tie it to a particular like initiative, but it was really for expanding the staff to operate more service and maintain things. We can find that out.
All right, well,
Yeah,
we can,
that's
Yeah, we've got,
basically-
we can send this.
we can just put a pin in it for now. I'm just
Yeah.
part of what we're doing is, right, we're raising questions about the presentation, so keep going, please.
Right. On the capital budget side, we went at it a couple ways. One was we looked at the draft CTP, the 2025-2030 draft CTP. We took the MTA capital number and subtracted out MARC, Purple Line, Freight Rail, non-regional lots, a number of things. There's a bit of mess in there because there's some agency-wide capital expenditures, and they're very hard to allocate from the level that we were working at. But basically what we got down to is that the core capital budget in the CTP was about 285 million. And the overall 6-year projected average was about 380 million a year. And again, this is really focusing on the Baltimore core and subtracting out those other parts of things that we would see as continuing to be part of a statewide MTA effort. There was minor system preservation capital in there that we did include for the Baltimore region lots. If there were numbers in there for bus replacement or expansion, we rolled those numbers in. But again, it's a close approximation, but some of it goes down to the differences in allocating the agency-wide numbers and the smaller minor preservation projects. So it could be a little bit different. From MTA, we got an estimate of capital needs that comes from their 10-year projection, the state of good repair. Now, you've had a couple of good presentations from MTA folks earlier in March and in the updates with the state of good repair numbers and the modernization. The real point here is when you take those numbers, they're higher than that average CTP investment that's planned. There's an unmet need here. This is not news to you, I don't think. We combined the lines, the data from the term light state of good repair needs with the modernization expansion needs, which are the light rail transition, the zero emission bus, and put those together. And the reason there's a negative number, everybody looks at that, is that really has to do with the FY25, the lower number that's available from the CTP, that there was a additional funding kind of beyond that immediate need. And that's the way it turns up in the numbers. So the gap really is about 326 million a year. And I want to say also that my understanding is these numbers are a moving target that MTA is working on updating and revising the state of good repair numbers all the way along. So they could come back in January and say, no, it's really 500 million, or I doubt it would be less.
Yeah. These align with what's published in January, correct?
These align with what was presented a few months ago.
Got it.
We're due for an update of
Right.
our capital needs inventory.
Yeah, we went
Last
ahead and used your current
analysis.
numbers to make this point. But anyway, there might be a subsequent report that would change that kind of number. For the lots spending, we looked at what MTA has budgeted, and MTA pays, uses state funding combined with the local dollars for the lots in the Baltimore region. From working on the transit development plans, we know that the counties and the city overmatch the available state money, and that there's a lot of local relative of local money that goes into the lots on the operating side, not so much on the capital. So rather than the $12 million amount that was in some of the tables that we got from MTA, we think the real total annual operating costs are more like 48 million at this point. And that the annual capital spending, it's very lumpy because of, if you look at the 5-year transit development plan, some years there's not much expansion or not much need for replacement, and then there'll be another year that's big. It kind of averages out to about 10 million a year. So there is a component there. And I will say in the transit development plans, if you look at it, a 5-year plan number, there's a fair amount of expansion planned for in there as well. And so there would be an additional need. For example, Baltimore County has a vision plan that calls for a substantial expansion in their lots program. This is the $1.2 billion number that Bethany mentioned a minute ago, but basically it rolls together the previous slides. I think the real point of this, that big number, is that marching off and starting your own RTA without all of that state support is essentially not possible. The region just couldn't come up with 1.2 billion to run that. I don't think that's a surprise or anything like that. So it would be a real challenge for a completely new, separate, independent agency to get that funding, become the federal recipient, and set up a completely independent transportation authority. So in the context of all of that, how does this Transportation Commission get a basis for having a seat at the table and being able to advocate within MDOT to address all of these needs?
Can I ask you to go back one slide?
Sure.
You explained your tentative conclusion or observation about 3. By 4, when you say Transit Commission, you mean the commission that you've proposed, the structure that you
Right,
proposed as our third option. You don't address the middle option, at least the way you presented them.
The
state-controlled RTA. And I guess my question is are you implicitly saying that one presents sort of the least trouble? I mean, you've identified in 3, here's the problem with independent agency. In 4, you said the Transit Commission can struggle. Does that sort of mean that the state-controlled RTA is, in your view, sort of more appealing for some reason? I'm trying to get a little beat on your.
Yeah, I don't think we're saying that here, but I think we'll circle back to that. Or that
You're gonna get
issue,
that?
because there are issues with that. I know there's issues with an MTA that is still a state agency as opposed to an independent agency, and its ability to act and contract and hire the additional people to do expansion and things like that. At the same time, the Transit Commission that has some funding and is trying to get a voice, it needs to have some kind of board or an entity that it can participate in to make that voice heard. And having an impact on that board, what we're saying here basically is that it needs to be, there needs to be a forum in effect where the Transit Commission could really make that impact. And it probably will have to bring money to the table. Not all of this money, but a substantial part of the funding. We talked a lot about funding strategies. I think you've seen a version of this slide before. We started with a long list of potential funding sources that a Transit Commission or a separate RTA could use. Some of these are already in play in Maryland. We'll kind of look at them very briefly, but we've crossed out a lot of them as either not generating very much funding, or it's already in use, or there would be other issues. We know from earlier work that things like property taxes for this region are very difficult. City of Baltimore already has very high property tax rates. I think there's already people looking at the county income taxes and increasing those for meeting other revenue needs. That might be something. Anyway, this was kind of the menu that we looked at, and there's a few that kind of popped out as the key ones. We probably need to consider passenger fares. We considered tolls, because we have a number of toll facilities. We know the Train Commission has also looked at collecting additional revenue from the tolls beyond that required by their bonding and their revenue needs. Regional sales tax and regional payroll tax. So passenger fares, now one thing I have to say.
Can I do, Simone has a question, I want to.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a quick and easy one, and it relates to the funding strategies in the chart that you were just talking through. I was looking to make sure I didn't miss it before I posed the question. Did you do this per alternative? This looks like the funding strategies that are proposed here, it looks like just a menu in a global perspective.
It's a global perspective.
I can't hear you.
It's a global perspective, yeah.
It might make sense to apply that to each of them to have a more comprehensive fiscal conversation. I don't know if you've done that and just did not include it here. I see the menu and the menu makes sense, but
Right.
applying that to each of the alternatives may prove fruitful,
Now,
more
no, I hear
productive
what
of
you-
a conversation.
I think we can
When-
discuss
when we
each
get there.
alternative in terms of the most likely funding sources and how they would relate.
Yeah, we did look at every funding source and looked at how much money it could raise. And then in some of them, we went back and said, okay, like if we did a hotel tax, for example, what is Maryland currently charging, you know, what's recent experience been? And then we said, you know what, let's take that off.
I say that because you took great care with the individual of the three alternatives. But then when you get to the funding strategy, which is the true meat and potatoes,
Okay.
you kept that separate as a global conversation, and the global conversation makes sense. But now it makes sense to also, as we continue this, to apply the funding strategies to each of the alternatives. Because, for example, if we're talking to a room of the county executives and the mayor of Baltimore, when you say funding strategies and it's global, they want to know what it means for each of the alternatives. So I just want you to think about that. You probably have it somewhere, right?
We do.
I know you did your due diligence. So if it would make sense, if the commission, the other commissioners agree that you apply this to each of the alternatives, right? Because then that spans out the net of the conversation and it would be most helpful.
Yeah, I think we've certainly talked through that a lot, that this one would work best with this one. I see what you're saying. In terms of passenger fares, basically we ended up, you could increase fares. And let me just say that these numbers, the base numbers here are for MTA as a whole. This is not just the core bus. It would take a lot more separating out to actually do this for the different modes and service areas. But basically the overall finding, I think, is really increasing the fare by 25 cents gets you another 17 million a year. A 50-cent fare on your base cash fare gets you about 34 million a year. This doesn't take account of the fact that you're going to lose some trips and some riders by raising fares. So it's not, we might say we want the users to pay a share of whatever we need, but it's not going to get us to the kinds of level of investment that we were talking about. Looking at the tolls, basically we come up with that if you added this is sort of the Baltimore region toll thing, that if you added a 25-cent increase on each toll trip, we could get 26 million out of it. If you go to a dollar on all of the central Maryland locations, you get to 103 million, which is getting close to the kinds of numbers you would want to have to really be able to participate in transit improvements in the Baltimore region. And I mentioned before, I think the Train Commission is already looking at this for the general transportation needs as well.
Let me make one observation, I guess, well, why don't you do sales and payroll and then I'll say what I was gonna say.
Okay. Sales tax, a lot of transit systems around the country rely on a sales tax add-on to support the transit system. It generates a lot of money. It's a little bit vulnerable to economic conditions. Sales go down, tax revenue goes down, you have problems. And sales tax increase of 1% generates about 447 million statewide based on the base numbers we've got. And obviously, if you did a 0.5%, you get a half of that, 223 million. So that's really the Baltimore region, which our figures show is about 40% of the sales tax revenue statewide. The payroll tax is kind of interesting. It's not widely used across the country. The examples that we started with kind of are from Oregon and the TriMet area in Portland. But basically, it's collected from employers, and it's we all know of payroll taxes that employers pay their share of your Medicare Medicare taxes and so on. But anyway, one big advantage is that a very small percentage spread across a very large source of income can generate significant funding. And if you did it as a flat tax across the state, it would fall more heavily on the transit intensive areas where there's more employment. The taxing system can be set up to focus on particular sub areas. The TriMet Portland tax thing has a very defined area, and employers within that area pay that payroll tax. And it could supplement other taxes as well. So anyway, it has the potential to generate a significant amount of money, 0.1% based on what we believe is the wages in this central Maryland region would generate 100 million. The TriMet, I think, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they generate about 525, 550 million out of not 0.1 cent, but 0.08. So anyway, there's significant revenue that can be generated from a payroll tax.
So now I'll say what I was gonna say, I wanted you to throw it for this. In terms of, how I framed this at the beginning, I mean, the value add here, I think there's enormous value add in this report with respect to the structures, because I think most people who are gonna be seeing this have not thought about that at all, except in the very most general terms. Should we have an independent authority or leave it the same? We haven't thought about sort of the continuum. I also think that, to some extent, I guess maybe people thought about the fares. But I think everybody needs to understand sales, payroll, tax, and tolls are all got discussed. I mean, they all got discussed at the Train Commission because, even though there weren't recommendations directly made, and especially sales and payroll, maybe not so much tolls, are discussed every year all the time about, can we raise revenues, et cetera. So my only point is that, I think these slides are basically saying, hey, these are a couple of things that you should be thinking about, and they're useful for the scale of a dollar leads to this, leads to that. But one of the reasons, that, for example, it'd be hard for this commission to say anything directive about them is because they're gigantic, multifactorial issues. I mean, sales tax, state sales tax, big deal, local option sales tax not permitted by law, tolls, Jackie will hit me if I don't say this, tolls, tolls are lockboxed at MDTA right now. There was discussion at the Train Commission about whether they could come out of MDTA and be used for other other initiatives, but that's not the law right now. So these are like gigantic issues, and I think it's good for us to remind everybody, here are some options, but
these would all be a big lift. I'm with you on that.
not only a big lift, but they're very complex. I mean, that's the point, so I just want everybody to understand.
And I know the Washington region, certainly MDOT is looking for ways to fill its revenue gaps, and the Washington region, WMATA, they're looking at their issues as well. So these may be more appropriate for a global solution. I don't disagree with you at all on that. Thank you for the caveat on that. So, back to you.
All right, so one thing I do wanna, again, we have this caveat that anything requires MDOT to change the way that they're doing business right now. And this idea that the state would set aside and quantify and agree to a certain amount of funding for transit, right? That is a fundamental principle for any of these. That is not I can't emphasize enough that that's a big lift. That's a hugely complicated step. The other thing that I wanted to mention about funding, a lot of times when regions or transit agencies go and ask the taxpayers for money, they promise to do new things. I think this is something Fred keeps reminding us of. And so you say, okay, you give us a half cent on the sales tax or whatever it is. And then you say to them, and we're gonna do this for you, right? We're gonna build you a new light rail line. We're gonna increase service frequencies by 10%. That is a challenge to do in this region. If you are an independent RTA, get the voters to agree to it because of that state of good repair number that Fred showed you earlier. And then I think we saw some of the problems that the state's having. It is, when you take this over, or if you take this over, there's some back stuff that you have to do. Like you just bought a house and you're repairing the roof, you're changing the plumbing, you're putting insulation in, like stuff that people can't see. And all of the interesting and exciting stuff is gonna have to come later. So that is gonna be a challenge for you if you take this on, is that there is still structural things that need to be repaired. Many of those structural things are super expensive. They're not gonna go away anytime soon. And so that can be a communication and a challenge for taking this on. But again, we have the slide and we do some comparison about the different models. I don't need to go into these. I don't know if you have any more questions. This mostly summarizes what we've talked about. We do make a recommendation on one of these. For the independent RTA, we recommend the payroll tax. We do the same for the Regional Transit Commission. And then for the state-controlled RTA, we leave that one a little bit more vague, but we do have some ideas that we'll be writing up for you all to consider. I think there's one more slide. Yeah, just advantages and disadvantages. So I know.
Yeah, well, time is expired basically, but what, specific questions while these guys are standing up here? So here's what I'm gonna propose. Like I said, I think to a large extent, I view this as providing a service and also allowing us to be kind of a focus group in a way, like, anticipate lots of questions. So we've done that today, I think effectively. People have had very good questions and comments. I think there's more, there are a handful or more of things where we've said, it would be better if you could do this, show this, so we should think about how to get that done. I'm also gonna leave, some window of time, we'll figure out what it is, some reasonable, but not, soon, where people can go through this, mark it up, provide any comments, and I'm gonna ask you to get them to Don, where you really are like, I don't get this, or does this mean this, or does this mean that? Again, to try and refine anything here and get rid of any ambiguities or questions or concerns. And then we're just gonna get this thing out there, and we're gonna stand behind it as having provided the first time I've seen a real discussion of these issues and ways that you could solve it. And then we're gonna offer and insist on participating in the conversation. But I think the value is what we've done, and let's get it, let's try and add to this conversation. There are, I think there are conversations going on in the state about, are there other ways we could do this? It began last session when I was down there. People are like, what if we did this? What if we did that? And I think, people are gonna be very interested in the impact of governance structures on revenue, on whose money is being spent, who's required to put money in. I mean, there are all those questions, that have to be asked. How much is this gonna cost me? Those are questions that people ask, right? Like local governments who are under stress, and what's the benefit and what's the burden? What's the upside and downside? So I'm very anxious to get those conversations moving, particularly as we head to the session. So, let's get it going. Let's finish it up. Don?
I just wanted to say that we are this is a presentation, but we are gonna have a written report with more narrative that does describe in more detail a lot of what you've seen here.
Great.
So at that point, I think we need to, at the point we get the report done, we will get that out to the commission and look for specific.
What do we think is the window? I'm sorry, I don't know the details.
So maybe the end of next week, but definitely the week.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, we're doing this and then we're writing it up, but I would also say, or we've been writing it up. If anybody wants to have a talk with us about this presentation as a sidebar, we're happy to do that too. Because I know it's a lot all at once, and some people have seen it a bunch, and some people have maybe seen it for the first or second time.
Thanks.
Do you have an opportunity to review before it goes out? Cause I know we sent you a lot of raw data and I just wanna make sure that the raw data was being interpreted.
Yeah, no, that's a good idea.
Like I said, I don't want this, I mean, look, I guess it's possible there'll be a disagreement about some piece of data, and if that's the case, so it goes, but I don't wanna get out there and have people arguing about the data on page 7, that just doesn't make sense, right? So, okay, so we're really out of time, and, Don's gonna be very upset because we're not gonna get to the annual report discussion. Let me just give you my very quick view about the annual report. It's a report of what happened. It's not an action item, it's not it's not an affirmative statement, it's a report. So I actually feel confident that the staff, with some input from me and DeAndrea, can put together a report that reports on what we did. And we will figure that out. We'll do it as quickly. I have a December 1st deadline statutorily. We will do our best to get that to you, but honestly, it's not gonna get written by committee. I mean, that's not practical, and that's not what it's supposed to be. So we will do the best we can in the next few weeks. We do need to meet a deadline. But there should be nothing surprising in an annual report of this commission, since it should just embody everything that we have done. And Don will have to just work that out, but, sorry. All right, so the public participation is mandated, and so I would ask you all to stand by for a few minutes to see if we have any public participation, so that we can accommodate that. Staff, do we have anybody either here or online?
No.
So we will do all of those things, get back to you as described. I do want to save some time. What's our next meeting date, Don?
We need to set one.
We don't have a December
We
meeting?
do have a December date.
Yeah.
The 8th.
Well, we'll get to that date in a moment. It may already be in your calendar. The 6th. We will say this to you in writing in advance of that meeting. I would like to have some time reserved for a sort of a retrospective on this year. I would like to know from the commission, how you think it went, what we might do better, what we might do differently. We're making this up as we go along. I'm personally very pleased and proud with the work that we've done together. But people may have views for ways to improve it, or even critiques, and that's perfectly fine. So expect that at that meeting, we'll have at least some time to just kind of go, people can, it can be substantive things. It could be, we don't need to meet as often. It could, we should address at the next meeting, for example, the monthly, bi-monthly thing, because I don't want to decide that unilaterally. If people feel strongly, we should get some. So we'll remind you of that, but I just wanted to mention it while we're sitting here as well. Anything else? Don, anything else? Motion to adjourn? So we'll second? Second. Okay, we'll be adjourned. Thank you all very much. Thank you.